So like I said, let me just make sure the microphone is on. Yes. Who's here? Cece, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good. Like I said, on the P drive, you guys can download the sample project that I'm going to be working on and follow along directly in that project, or you could just open whatever Unreal Engine 4 project and just kind of follow along what I'm doing. It might not fit the environment, but it's really about learning the mechanics of Blueprint today and doing some like work towards making your scene look a little bit more polished. And looking at a little bit of cinematics as well. Are people upstairs? You see anybody? No? Pretty poor showing this morning. How's everyone feeling, first and foremost? I'll let you guys prepare your breakfast and just have a little chat. No, it's totally fine. I love your breakfast, Andy. It's like the breakfast of champions.
Yeah.
How's everyone feeling? I know there's some questions that have been trickling in. Do you have access to the T drive?
Yeah, but am I allowed to open the file with you guys? Or should I-
No. Copy it to your C drive first.
Uh,
Do not open these files from network drives. It's not, you're not going to get good results. It's in the there's a folder called underscore 1019 CVR. And then UE5.
Thanks.
Is everyone good though? Feeling summer is rejuvenating you guys. The energy bars are going back up, ready for the fall. Oh my God, let's not talk about that yet. I'm not ready for that. Who's excited for second year of school? Really? Oh no, it's not.
Oh, okay.
It's like any trilogy movie, right? Like Star Wars. The first one is like, oh, okay, you're very hopeful. You have no idea what it's about. You just go through it. And then second year is like Empire Strikes Back. You find out Darth Vader's your father. It's very sad. And then the third year is fantastic. So yeah, something to look forward to. Sure. At least that's how it was for me. I don't think that's how it is for everybody. A long time ago. In a galaxy far, far away, yes. And we weren't doing any of this stuff. The summer visualization course is pretty sad. You guys get to choose like from so many different topics. It's kind of hopefully useful and fun for you guys. But you guys get to pick your studios, right? It's a lottery for second year. We didn't get to pick. I don't think we got to pick. No, we got assigned. It's still kind of like a comprehensive building design, right? Yeah. Okay, and then urbanism. You guys hear stories about these studios you're about to. 2024, yeah. Is that what open? Go to the VR template. Go to your content folder. I think in the VR template maps, I think if you open this map, maybe you didn't copy the entire thing over.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Remember, Unreal projects live in the entire folder. You got to move all of them over. You probably can't even, I'm surprised you could even open it without the entire folder being over, and you might want to let it fully copy over before you try to open the file. As a quick reminder, the 2 quests are in the office now. You guys will vote yourselves on which projects are quote unquote the best projects. And we'll have an invited jury. They'll provide feedback, but they don't vote, right? This is purely student run. So hopefully you want these. You might not even want one. That's the other thing. But hopefully it's useful for you, and it'll be helpful in your second year coursework even. What else? So no questions? I know, Tara, you had some issues with the character.
Yeah, I think so I don't know if right, no, I assumed it. When I tried it right now, it looked there. When I opened the file, so it might.
Okay, I have a feeling so what did you do? Did you bring in a third person character?
Yeah. And then I just like make sure that settings for character don't work. And then look at a video and try to assign like, keys for moving forward and moving backward. And
Okay.
I tried to make sure everything was okay, and I even like made it a pawn character. I think something it's supposed to be.
Okay.
And you know, he wasn't falling to the floor anymore, but when I clicked like this would have noticed him right away.
So you shouldn't have, I mean, you shouldn't have to do any of that stuff in theory. What you could do is change your game mode. But even if you didn't, you should still be able to possess this character. And so with the character highlighted, you're going to want to go to auto possess character, set this to player 0. Did you do this? So you just have to set this to the player 0. And then when you hit play, you should possess that character. But let's just try to simulate. And then if I hit my W key, it's not working. Maybe it's not simulate. I need to actually play. So let's play. Well, I'm falling through, which is what happened to you too, right? So I need a collider. So let's just put a cube underneath this character for now. So now if I hit play, I can see myself, right? And then if I start tapping my keys, I can start to move. If I move too far, I'm just going to fall off that cube. But you just have to set the possess, the auto possess. Yeah, so highlight your character. And you just need to change this auto possess player, right? This is only if you have an actual player character in your scene. If you have a player start, what the player start is doing is it's reading what's the game mode. And so if it's a VR game mode, it's going to spawn a VR pawn into that spot. If it's third person game mode, it's going to spawn a third person character onto that spot. And so it'll automatically spawn the character that you're possessing. But if you dragged in a character, you'll have to make sure that you'll set that character to be the character that gets possessed by that. Yes,
Okay,
right.
that's what I did. I just have to now set it to
Yeah, yeah. But then you're not in VR, right? You're playing a third person character.
also look at a good setup like for movement. It
Mhm.
seems like the easiest way to trigger it and capture that is once for a person to walk through it, rather than like shut up and auto play thing where as soon as you hit play, like the door opens. I thought it was easier to just have it if you walk through it and see if the door works.
Yeah, I mean, all of that is using colliders, right? So if your pawn, and we'll go through this today too, if your pawn has a collision, that interaction will also trigger the door to open. So if you have a collider in front of a door and my VR hands, I put a collider on it. If I cross over that collision box, that door should still open. Right? So the door blueprint is just looking for that overlap event to occur. Right? You guys know what events are, right? From the blueprint quiz, right? An event is just something that triggers a blueprint to start, right? We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but when we start making our own blueprints. So I'm going to make a couple of simple little blueprints today, make simple material, right? But all in the service of the narrative I'm trying to develop for my project, right? And so if we go back to my reference images, right? I'm trying to kind of develop a narrative around the individual use of these capsules, and use like some of these scenes for my cinematic, try to replicate some of these scenes for my cinematic. And my VR experience is I'm going to let the player start inside one of these empty capsules and just kind of occupy that space, right? So again, I maybe wanting to prefer limiting their movement, so confining them inside of a capsule and letting them just kind of explore one of the units as opposed to walking around the building or going into the corridor even, or maybe I'll let them step out into the corridor or something like that. Or maybe it's like a escape room and they need to figure out how to get out or something like that, right? So just kind of thinking of a series of interactions or some kind of a mechanic, right? But remember, when you put a player in these kinds of spaces, it's like putting a mouse in a maze, and you have to sort of give them motivation or use just intuition, like our understanding of human intuition to create those interactions, right? So like if I put a button somewhere, I might, if I'm in a VR space, be inclined to try pushing it. If I put a hammer somewhere, I'll probably want to pick it up and try to smash something with it, right? So just kind of trying to choreograph that in your scenes. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
When you hold the door from line and you want to file the difference to it. Is it possible? Because on the tutorial, it was like the doors that the door that was used was wrong.
Yeah. 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 I mean, you could use anything as a door. What you just have to be in control of is, you guys remember from the quiz what a transform is? Right? What's a transform? It's three sets of three variables, right? And what are those three sets? Yeah, scale, rotation, and location, right? And so what is the origin of the door? Yeah, that makes sense, right? That makes sense if you want to be able to open it, right? Or if you want to introduce a rotational movement, that pivot point being at where the hinge would be located makes sense, right? Because I can go in and say I'm in my space here. I'm just going to type G to go into the game mode here. And I'm going to drag in a cube here, right? And I can scale this, right? And make it taller. And I could basically turn this into a door, right? But if I go to my rotation, this door is like kind of pivoting from the center, right? So these cubes have an origin that's set at the center location, right? So what I might want to do is when I make my door in Rhino, make my origin where the hinge is located at, right? Alternatively, I could drag in something else like a sphere. I'm going to look at my top mode, right? And I can move this sphere to, let's say, be a stand-in for my hinge, right? And then I can take my cube. So there's sphere and cube. Let's just rename this so they're next to each other. Door, hinge. And I'm going to select this cube. And I'm just going to call this door, right? So if I make the door, right? So last time we talked about parent-child relationships, right? And so in this case, what I can do is I can make the parent my hinge, because the hinge is kind of dictating what the door is supposed to do, right? And so now if I go back into my perspective view, right, I can take my door hinge. I don't want it to look like a sphere, right? Or I could use a cylinder and make it look like a sphere and shrink it down and make it look like a hinge. But if I just want this sphere to just serve as the center of the door, I can just make it not appear, right? So I'm gonna go to rendering and just make this a hidden object, right? And now if I rotate the sphere, I can sort of simulate the door move, right? All this to say is you have to control these three key vectors and where they are relative to the geometry, right? Because now I can take this set of assets, turn them into a blueprint that somehow becomes this thing that I can push around and move, right? I can probably do it where I can make this a physics actor, right? Constrain its movement, and just so by pushing it with my VR hands, just make it swing around, right? But again, I need to control where that axis is, right? So I think the trouble you might be having is you brought in a door-like element, but the computer doesn't know what to do with it. It doesn't understand that it's a door. So you have to kind of add more attributes to it that make it behave like a door, like adding a hinge or setting the origin of that door, the pivot point of the door, to be in a location that makes it work more door-like. But at the end of the day, it's just like a rectangle, right? Does that make sense? And so maybe as part of our tutorials, I'll like make a door that kind of moves. Yes.
I was asked if actions taken in like third person templates or first person templates are the same that should be taken to blueprints and VR templates, because I was trying to like simulate infinite votes for the player. And I was following like a third person template tutorial. I swear I didn't do it right, but like it just wouldn't work on VR.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
I was also trying to simulate like buoyancy to vote to keep it afloat from the VR template, but every time I hit it literally the sun.
Every time you hit float?
Okay, it just.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So there's gravity,
Yeah.
right? So gravity always works. And so you need something to hold the boat up.
So I need to do like a plane.
Yes, or just turn off gravity, right? You can make something move, but without gravity, right? But you could also constrain certain axes, right? So for all of the transforms that we have the ability to constrain movement. So if we only want something to move on the XY plane, I can constrain any movement on the Z axis so that it only translates on an invisible plane that's sort of like water, right? And then later on, I could sort of add like a rocking movement to it, just like a random, like if the thing just kind of bobs up and down to simulate what being on a boat on water might feel, that make sense? And so again, the computer doesn't know that a boat is a boat. It doesn't know that water is water, right? The appearance of something is only relevant to us in our understanding of the world, but we have to build into all of these assets, all of these mechanics, right? Computers are very, very dumb in that way, right? So we have to tell it like, okay, where is the position of this thing at all times? Like, how do we want this to move? Do we want it to move fast? Do we want it to move slow? How far do we want it to go? We kind of have to tell it all of those things in order for it to work, right? Because it's not going to recognize a door as a door or a window as a window until we give it the properties that necessitate that, which is just a series of attributes. Okay. Good. So we'll look at something similar to what maybe you're trying to do. Let's take a look at my scene. I have the door in here. I just hit it. If I hit G, I'm jumping from game mode, right? And I can also access the G here. Where is it? Right, game view, right? Game view just means I'm seeing what a player playing the game will see. And if I turn it off, I'm seeing all of these other props, like the camera, right? I added a rig rail here. And I'm working on my cinematic, right? Based on, the sketches and the things that I was doing. So I want to do something where I'm spiraling up the stairs that start to depict time, and then I have my storyboards, and I'm trying to run through that in Unreal Engine, right? So I'm going to go ahead and just quickly go into my cinematic. I'm going to do my side-by-side view, and then I'm going to find my level sequence actor in my scene. And then go to the details and click on this open level sequence, right? So my left viewport is going to be my cinematic viewport, and my right viewport, I just want free control. So I'm going to uncheck this so that I can freely rotate and move around in this space, right? What I can also do here is, it's kind of dark in here, so I'm going to brighten this up artificially just by changing essentially my exposure settings, right? So I can see what's going on a little bit better. Alternatively, I can go to this view mode and go to unlit, but it's almost too bright, right? This is just no lighting information at all, right? So I'm actually just going to keep it on lit, except I'm just changing my exposure so that I can see a little bit better inside of this space, right? But the left side is giving me what the actual lighting conditions are going to be when I hit the play button, right? So let's kind of assess what we have. I have a camera on a rig rail, and I created a sequence. So if I go into the sequence, I basically have my rig rail here, my camera actor here, and a transform of my camera that I'm keying. And you can see that I placed some keyframes here. So as I scrub through, I'm just moving that camera and doing like a spiraling movement up the stair. And if we go to the top view, maybe it'll be a little bit more apparent. Right. I'm going to unselect. Right. So that little purple thing, squiggly thing, is my rig rail, right? As viewed from the top. As I scrub through, you can see my camera is just moving around, right? And I'm like getting glimpses into these capsules, right? And I'm going to try to start developing my cinematic sequence using this as a shot, right? I also have my camera, right? So remember, if you recall from the rig rail conversation before, I can click on this to lock the orientation of my childed actor on the rig rail to match the rig rail itself. But I actually don't want to do this with a camera because that also, as I climb up the stairs, it's also like tilting my camera view, which is very unnatural, right? We usually see kind of without tilting our head side to side, right? So in this case, this doesn't work for me. And so what I did instead was I just went into my camera and just changed the Z rotation to sort of turn to point to where I wanted it to point at various points. Right, at various points. So as the rig rail rotates, you can see the rig rail platform isn't changing its rotation, but the camera is just moving relative, right? And so again, at each of these points, I'm rotating the camera by about 90 degrees each. So here we have 90, here we have 180, and at the end we have about 270. And for whatever reason, this started at minus 90.
Track the camera's object.
Yes. Yes. The way you do that is with your camera selected, there's something called look at tracking settings, right? So I check this box and I can select whatever actor I have in the scene, and the camera is going to point to that, no matter where it's at. Yes. Okay. So the reason I want to set this up is because now that I've kind of set up my camera movement, right? I know exactly what I need to work on, right? I only need to really work on what's visible to that camera, right? At least when it comes to the cinematic, right? When it comes to the player in VR, right? I could do an entirely different file and just put one of the capsules in there, and that's all that the player is going to experience. Can't get out of the box, right? I can basically control, as I said in the first day of class, the 6 sides of the cube by, in this case, putting the player inside of the cube, right? And just locking them in there, right? And so those kind of establish for me that to-do list of what needs work and what can be ignored, right? So I can build my world entirely based on what's visible to this camera, right? And so here you can kind of see that I've changed the interior of my capsule, and I'll send you a link to the tutorial that I'm using, but I'm literally taking these photographs and starting to use them to texture some of these capsules, right? And again, this is going to appear for a second, at most 2 seconds in my entire sequence. And so I don't want to spend a ton of time working on that, right? What I want to focus my energies on are, let's say, the VR scene, because that's where the player is actually going to spend a lot of time in. So I'll continue to work on my capsules and work on the cinematic, and I'll post some additional tutorials just so you can see what I'm doing. But all I'm trying to do is just capture the feel of what these reference images are offering, and just bringing them in to just the parts of my scene that are visible to the camera or visible to the player, right? If we go into the content browser, with my Datasmith import, if you recall, I just used this drawing initially to make all of those Rhino boxes, right? Let me open Rhino real quick. Let's just open Photoshop while we're at it. Feels like this is gonna crash. Right. So what Rhino or what Datasmith is doing is it's taking that Rhino model, right, to which I had plastered that drawing onto and then cut it into pieces and folded it, almost like a little paper model, right? What Datasmith is doing is it's recognizing the fact that I used that drawing and it's bringing it as a texture. Right, which is just a square image, right, that is used by materials. I'm going to just dock this here. And then it creates a material out of that, right? In this case, wrapped around a sphere, right? But it's using a texture file and it now knows how to apply that texture to the various walls that I modeled, right? And what I could do then is just take that same texture and export it out and start overlaying bits of my image and then creating a new material and just replacing that so I can start to make something look a little bit more realistic. Right? Or at least based on images that I've gathered as references, right? So here's another, let's go back to our perspective mode. So now if I go in, right, this is the one that I created. I'm gonna scrub my video forward. And let's say I want this one. So where's my camera? Right? I can start applying this as a material to all of these assets, right? Unfortunately, I have to do it one at a time, but whatever. Right? So now it's starting to look a little bit more realistic. And in this case, these don't want to be open, so I'm just going to kind of replace. Right? Again, I only care about what's visible. Right? So if it's not visible in the camera, I'm not going to care. Okay, so now I've got this one textured and I have this one textured as well. And it definitely looks better than the drawing. Maybe not perfect. So what I might do is cheat it further using the blurring in the camera or the depth of field in the camera just to kind of make it feel more real. In spite of the fact that, you know, these are just textures that are literally painted on these surfaces. Okay. And so all I'm doing again is taking that original Photoshop file and just layering on bits of elements by taking the original photo, cutting it, Control T, distort, and just stretching the image to align to the capsule drawing that I originally used. Right? Then I could just export this as a PNG file. And I could import them as these separate textures and turn those into material. Yeah, Tara. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could do it that way, right? So like if you had a skyline, for instance, like maybe in Rhino, I can drop that skyline onto a long surface and trim off the sky or something like that and use Unreal Sky. And now I have like it's kind of like a billboard that's far off in the distance. And you could do this if it's something that's far away, right? 'Cause after about 20 meters, our eyes lose the ability to perceive depth, right? So anything that's further than 20 meters away can be fairly flat and the image will hold up. If it's close, you could tell it's flat, right? And so again, you're just kind of dictating, is this foreground, midground, background, and applying the appropriate strategies, right? Also, how long is anyone going to see this for? If it's just like a brief second, I can do what I'm doing and get away with it, right? If it's something that the camera is going to focus on, I might not do this at all, and I might start applying materials and modeling things a little bit more thoroughly, right? And so the results should dictate the level of effort or technique that you're being to apply. Okay. So we haven't talked about Bridge yet, I don't think. Quixel Bridge is a company that was purchased by Epic Games, and they do a lot of like scanning of physical assets, and they're all freely available to use in Unreal. And so I can start looking for materials and things like that. But again, I want to base it on reality, right? And so maybe what I want to do is start to think about like these common areas, right? Because in my scene, my camera is kind of passing in front of a lot of these common areas. So I might want to find a texture and occasionally focus to it so that I'm sort of capturing the reality of what once was the Nakaja Capsule Tower, right? So this kind of looks like a stucco material, right? So I might go into Quixel Bridge and type stucco and like try to find something that works, right? That replicates that. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? But what's helpful is I have a reference, right? I know that there's a texture, it's kind of loose, it's not super tight. There are little cracks and things on it. There are control joints, right? There are random little caps and things like that on it as well, right? And so I'm just gonna, and they're like, whatever these are like access panels and things like that, right? These are just little elements that I'm gonna keep in the back of my mind. If I add it to my scene, it's gonna add a little bit more to the realism of the scene. Keeping all of that in mind, I'm gonna select a material that makes sense. Like even if it's not even the right color, like this black thing, it has a lot of like bumpiness to it. So maybe I'll try that out and see if I can just change the color or remove the color information. Or I might do something that's a little more subtle like this, right? And so say I want these two. I'm going to click on that little drop down green arrow. And once I get this check mark, I get this little sideways blue arrow, which allows me to migrate this directly into my project, right? I want to just make sure that this is medium quality. I could probably even try low, but medium is pretty safe. Don't go past that. You're probably not going to want or need anything higher than medium quality, right? Because all that's going to do is you're going to get larger texture files. It's just going to be a lot harder for your graphics card to process. And so if you try it on in VR and it looks stupid or it looks bad, then you might want to swap it to a high quality image, right? But start with medium. You might even start with low, especially if it's something very far away from you, or that doesn't take up a lot of real estate in terms of the pixels that you're utilizing, right? So I'm going to import these two assets. Go back to Bridge. I want to bring this stucco facade, right? So where's my camera? Right, so I might try with this surface first. So I'm going to drag this on. Doesn't really look like anything right now, does it? Right. The other thing to note when you're dealing with assets from Quixel Bridge is these are what are known as PBR materials, which are physically based rendered materials. And what those typically do is it is scaled to real world dimensions, right? So you'll see here that this little icon is indicating that this material is tileable, meaning that you're not going to see seams in between the actual square texture files, and that this is scanned to 2 meters by 2 meters, meaning one texture, right? Or one sort of unit of the texture. So if we go into our texture file and open it up, this image is 2 meters by 2 meters, right? And if we want to map that true to life in Rhino, what we need to do is we need to go into our Rhino file. Let me show my tower, right? If I want that texture, or if I want to use textures to texture the core of my building, right? Not the individual units, because I'm actually photoshopping and replacing those texture files. So I don't want to do what I'm about to do to these particular parts of my model. But for this stuff, what I might want to do is apply a UV box mapping to it. That's 2 meters by 2 meters, so that when I apply the material onto the surface, it's going to appear true to life. Does that make sense? Do you guys know what UV maps are in 3D world when you do renderings, right? It just changes the scale of the image of the texture map that you're using relative to the geometry. That I assume you, does anyone need more explanation? Okay, good. So do you guys know how to do UV mapping in Rhino? Yes, right? If you click on this properties tab, there's a little paint squirt, right? This is where your materials are. Next to it, you'll see like this checkerboard pattern, right? This is your UV mapping area, right? For most of architecture, right, which is very rectilinear, right, you could usually get away with applying a box map, right? So I'm going to click on a box map. I'm going to click anywhere, right? This is tileable, so it doesn't really matter where the box starts, but if you had like a brick joint or a seam that you wanted to align to an edge, you might be a little bit more careful with where you place it. But I'm just going to click on this corner, and I'm just going to type 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters. So I essentially am creating a 2 meters cube that is going to kind of repeat throughout the geometry that I've applied this mapping to, so that when I apply material in Unreal, it's going to appear correct. Okay. And so now what I can do is, right, and if we want to check to see that it's there, where am I? This one. Why isn't this working? It's stuck. But it's, I can't, pan. Which one is the show?
It's this one here.
This one?
And it should show. Maybe this view.
I don't know why. Oh, my perspective view is locked. How do I unlock this? Okay, there we go. Sorry, that was the problem, right? I'm going to do it again because I think I didn't hit enter. So I'm going to just highlight the core, go to my box map, and then 2 meters, 2M, 2M. Capped, yes. Cap just means it's going to apply a texture on top and on the bottom as well, right? And so now I can just highlight this model again. and do another Datasmith export. I'll just replace this one. And then go back into my Unreal. Find my Datasmith asset, re-import with new file. Re-import with new file. How come it's not letting me do this?
What file type did you say it was?
The U Datasmith,
Oh,
right? I don't know why this isn't letting me do this. So let's browse to this. So I'm going to see users. I see. I think it's because I copied this from a different computer. I don't know why it's not letting me. Let's open, can we open this asset? Okay, well, in theory, this should be allowing me to find a new Datasmith asset, in which case I would bring the newly mapped texture file over. The other way of correcting the appearance of your textures, which is a little less accurate, I'm going to go ahead and change this to game settings. Right, I'm just gonna remove the material completely. I get rid of. So I'm just gonna browse to that asset here. I'm gonna open up this asset, right? So this is the imported piece of my core, right? If I delete that world grid, like if I delete the material on this, what I see is this grid, right? And what this grid is showing me is how my textures are going to be mapped. on that material, right? What the actual textures are, right? And so we can see that it's kind of stretched, right? We want this checkerboard to be as square as possible at the very least, so that our materials don't appear skewed, right? So now if I apply the stucco material that we imported, right? We can see that that stucco material appears to be stretched out, right? So one way of fixing it is fixing it the way I did, which is applying a UVW map, a box map to my model, and then re-importing it in. But clearly I can't re-import it right now, right? And you might run into either that problem or just wanting to have a quicker fix to deal with this issue, right? So I'm gonna browse to this asset again, or just go to my Megascans folder. And if I double click on this stucco material, and I'm just undocking that so we can see side by side. The other way I can potentially fix, at least so it appears more correctly, is I could change the way that this material is tiled here, right? So the way this is tiling in X and Y is using one texture per one square in my checkerboard pattern, right? If I change this number, I can essentially stretch that material, right? Here, it no longer appears correct, but it appears more correct, let's say, in the model, right? So we're kind of inverting, like we're squishing it here so that it appears correct here, right? And this is kind of like a quick way of making something appear correctly without changing the UV mapping, right? But Quixel Materials allows you to change the tiling. You could change where the material starts and stops. So if there's like a seam somewhere you want to align, you can slide these over and kind of move that texture so that it's aligning to your geometry a little bit better, right? So if I had like a brick pattern, I might adjust that, adjust the offset here. You could also change the rotation of that material too, right? But that's what Quixel Materials allow you to do that, right? The other thing I can do here is because I want this texture to not be gray, but more like this sort of white color. I can go ahead and even turn off the albedo or see if I can change it by adjusting some of these other properties. So in my albedo controls, I can just make this brighter, right? And what this is doing is it's just brightening up the texture file. It's not adding light to my scene. Okay, so this is maybe one way I might do that, right? It's not quite right, but maybe it's good enough to start. And so now going back into my VR file, I can apply that material to this object. I don't know why I'm not seeing that material. Right. So this clearly doesn't look like this. So I'm going to keep working on it. Right. I could just take a photograph or take this photograph and start trying to apply it as well. Right. And maybe it's okay because in my cinematic, it's kind of blurred anyway. Right. But I'll want to add more lights to the scene so that it's going to appear as brightly as this. So that's the cinematics part of it, and like starting to kind of revise the model. So that it's no longer just a block out scene, but starts to have some of the properties that I'm interested in having for the cinematic, right? So I'm gonna go back to my single screen view and just kind of pivot to working on developing an interaction, right? So let's say for the sake of my VR experience, I'm just going to occupy this this top capsule, right? So when I play the cinematic and the VR scene starts, this is where my player is going to appear. I'll fix up the model a little bit, but now I want to focus on creating some interactions, right? So I want to start by making it very obvious what the character is intended to do inside of this space. I'm going to go back into my game settings because the lighting is a little bit moodier. What I'm going to do is create something of an answering machine and use a recorded message that the player can access to provide it with some more information, right? And so the way I'm going to alert the player that this is something to look at is by like literally making something blink and flash so that someone in VR is very obviously going to recognize that this is something that is of interest, right? I'm going to drag a sphere into my scene and I'm going to scale it down. Kind of pop it out here, right? If we look at our reference images, right, there's like a built into the millwork, the stereo equipment, right? I'm just going to turn one of these things, right, that's drawn here. It's very pixelated, but this is what this area represents. I'm going to basically turn the recording device or allow the player to play something from this stereo equipment. I'm going to use this sphere as a light. It's bigger than it needs to be right now, but that's okay. It's just going to be a stand-in for what may later become like this that I bring from Sketchfab or this, right? So in other words, I'm just going to start working on the mechanic, but I might replace some of these things with actual assets that I'm finding online so that it looks more realistic. It's a little bit more convincing, right? So let's start with the light. I need to alert my player of something. So I'm going to go and create a material. And I'm going to create a new folder. I'm just going to call this custom materials because these are materials that I'm making on my own. They're not imported. I'm going to right click, or I can click on this add button, and I'm going to create a material here. I'm going to use an M underscore to designate that it's a material. This is just an organizational strategy. I'm going to call this blink. And I'm just going to open that up, right? When you start dealing with materials, this is what you start out with, right? Basically a series of channels with nothing attached to them and just kind of a black material, right? The default base color is black, right? I want at least to give it some color. So I'm going to drag from this and I can do it in a couple of different ways, right? I can find a vector. What's a vector? Three values, right? Three values that represent what? Or it could be other things, right? It's not just location, right? we just designate a vector to be a location. We designate another vector to be rotation, and we designate another rotation or vector to be scale, right? But it's just three numbers that come in a sequence, which we usually call X, Y, and Z, right? But X, Y, and Z also corresponds to R, G, and B, right? So we can use a vector to mix colors in shaders or materials, right? So let's look at finding a vector, right? So I can pick constant 3 vector, right? The default is 0, 0, 0, right? 0 is no value, and 1 is, let's say, 100%, right? So if I type 1 in my X parameter, right, which corresponds to the red channel, right, it's going to turn my material red, right? So the computer doesn't know what red is. The way we communicate to the computer that we want the appearance of red is by adjusting 3 numbers that the computer can actually understand, right? So if we go to our VR template, you see how our widgets always have these 3 colors, right? So X always corresponds to red, Y always corresponds to green, and Z always corresponds to blue, okay?
When I click up, they kind of explode the material,
Mm-hmm.
the object.
Yes. 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 We'll go over that. I'll try to import something that has lots of pieces. I'll show you how to do that. Okay. So this is a constant value, right? The other way I could do it is I can use a parameter. I could use a vector parameter and call this light color. And the difference between a constant and a parameter or a variable is that one is constant and one is variable, right? So I might not always want the blinking light to be red, but I might create a material that allows me to have something blinking, but the color of the actual blinking light is variable, right? And so using a parameter just makes things a little bit more useful, because with a constant material, I can only use that material for things that I want to be red, whereas a material that has variability, I can use that same material and its properties and have the user define what color it's later on. Okay. And so it's always kind of more handy to use a parameter as opposed to a constant. But for all intents and purposes, they're going to look the same to you, right? Okay. But I'm going to use a parameter just so that we can see how useful it is later on. Okay. The other thing about these materials is the material that you start with is a surface material, right? But we can do different types. But for the most part, we're applying these materials to static meshes or surfaces. And so this is what you're probably going to use. There are moments where you might use a post-process material, which is a material that just kind of covers the entire scene. But we'll touch on that a little later on. So for the most part, it's surface. The thing you might change more frequently is this blend mode, right? A solid material is opaque, but if you wanted something that's cut out, you could use mask, right? So if I wanted to do a chain link fence without actually modeling a chain link fence, I can use a mask, kind of like in Photoshop, but apply that invisibility to a 3D object, right? So in that scenario, I would use mask. If I were to make glass or something like that, I would use translucent. And what this does is it just changes what channels I have available, right? So if I use a translucent material, I now have like an opacity value that I can change, right? Now I want to do a blinking light. And so what I actually want to do is use an opaque material that doesn't accept any shading, right? So default lit means that the material itself will accept lighting information from the scene. If I want something to light up, I can use what's called an unlit material. And now you can see that this material is just black, but I'm not getting any spherical information because the material is not accepting any lighting. Does that make sense? Right? This is just a pure black, right? I can't tell if it's a sphere or a flat circle, right? If I go to default lit, I can tell this is a sphere. It has a highlight. It has some rim lighting on the outside, right? So by switching this to unlit, I'm just not using any lighting information from my scene. And I have very limited nodes or channels that I can use, right? So instead of a base color, I'm actually going to use the emissive color, right? If I hit Alt, and click, I can break any chain, right? And again, I want this to be red, so I can double click on this, right? And I can make my red a value of 1, right? So this constant and this parameter are the same right now, but that's just because the constant has 3 values and the parameter is holding 3 values, and those 3 values are the same, right? So I can go into my map now. Well, first, let's apply and save. And so now I can go into my scene again. What's going on? Where's my sphere? Right? And I can apply this material to that, right? It's not looking right yet, but we're going to still work on it, right? We at least have a material and we've applied it, right? And I'm going to go ahead and change this. I'm going to call this something different so I can find it later. Let's rename this blinking light, right? So we actually want this thing to emit light, right? So I'm going to go back into my parameters here. And again, 0 and 1 kind of represents a percentage, right? 1 is 100% red, 0% green, 0% blue. And in this case, there's also another channel for alpha, which is transparency, right? If I wanted a green light, I would make this 0, make this 1, and it becomes green. And obviously, if I did that with blue, we would understand what would happen next, right? Or I can do mixes of those colors as well, right? Anything above 1, it's like saying I want 100, I want more than 100% of that color. And so what happens when we pass that stage of 1 is it starts emitting light, right? Between 0 and 1, it's reflecting light. Anything above 1, right, it's actually emitting light. This can't happen in reality, right? There's no paint that's going to emit light, right? You're actually adding energy to it. But in this case, in virtual land, we can do that. So if I set this to 10, I now have something that's glowing, right? It looks orange, but it's red that's glowing, right? And if I hit apply now and go into my VR map, we're going to see that it's taking on a new property, but you can't really tell that it's glowing, right? Because the actual sense of glowing has nothing to do with the light that's coming out of something. It has more to do with the atmosphere, right? So what I need in my scene that I don't have is what's known as a post-process volume, right? So I'm going to click on this little icon here in my Place Actors tab. And I'm going to look for what's called a post-process volume, and I'm going to drag it into my scene. And I have my post-process volume highlighted, right? And I can see what that looks like, right? It's a volume, it's a box, right? Which means anything inside of the box is going to affect the appearance of what we receive through the viewport or through the camera, right? It's like adding a layer of Photoshop within a volume so that I step inside of that volume, whatever Photoshop effects are in place appear to me, and if I step out of that volume, that disappears, right? And to give you a sense of how that looks, what that means is, let's open the color grading here, and I'm gonna just change my color temperature and just drop it. And if I move my camera into that volume, it's going to be affected by that post process, right? So if I turn this off again, it's back to normal, right? But I essentially change the color temperature just inside of that space, right? And I could do the opposite, right? I'm going to bump it way up and it starts to become a little more sepia, right? And basically, whatever is available to me here, I can effectively change within that volume, right? If I want these post processes to affect the entire world, right? All I need to do is check this box called infinite extent, which means this volume is unbounded. It's going to affect everything, right? So if I check this box and go back, oh, and then I change the color temperature. Now, if I fly out of the box, it doesn't matter. It's still applying that to the entire world, right? So in order for us to understand how the light's going to react, we actually want to change or add what's called bloom, right? If I add bloom and start increasing the intensity of it, you can kind of see it has like that foggy glow, sort of like applying a little Vaseline onto a lens, right? Or adding a little fog into the soup, right? So the light is actually being affected by lens effects or atmosphere. And that's what's generating the glowiness of a light. It's not the light itself, right? And we can sort of maybe get a better sense of its redness, right? If I bump this value up to say 100 and hit apply, and we go back to our scene, we can see that the color is kind of the same, but we just see more of its effect on the bloom aspect of our environment, right? And so maybe I like something in between, and this might work. The other thing I could do is just change the lighting of the interior, right? If I darken the interior, my light gets brighter, right? And so I can essentially add light or subtract or add darkness to make a light more intense, right? So now this is where my VR player will spawn. They might see that light and think that something is going on, but I want to be even more conspicuous. I want to make the light blink. And in order to do that, I can go into my material and do a couple of other things, right? So I'm going to add a time node. And I'm going to add another parameter, except this time I want a scalar parameter. And I'm going to call this blink speed without the slash. And I'm going to give it a default value of 1. right? And I'm gonna just do a little math, which is multiply time by this parameter, right? Anything times 1 is just 1, right? Or anything times 1 is just whatever that anything, right? And then I want to use some more math. I want a sine curve. You guys know what a sine curve is? Right? It's like yeah, it's like one minus one, right? So over a period of time, what this sine curve is doing is it's increasing the value to 1, decreasing it back to 0, going back to -1. That make sense? Right? So I'm using that curve to create a light that's going to go brighter and darker, brighter and darker. Right? So I'm going to apply, how did I do this last? Right? So this math is affecting the strength of the sine. And I want to multiply again my light value, right? Again, these are just numbers, right? So this is going to multiply 10 times whatever is being pumped out of my sine curve, right? And what it's going to do is it's just going to go from basically 10 to -10, right? Following the sine curve over a period of time. And if I increase this number, it's just going to blink faster, or it's going to blink slower, right? But I'm making this a variable so that I later on can say, oh, that's not blinking fast enough, or that's blinking too fast, right? Depending on the objectives of what I want this thing to do. I want this to call or draw someone's attention. So maybe I want this to blink a little bit faster, right? Or even brighter, right? Because I can also do another parameter. Well, let's just leave it at 20. That's fine. But you get the idea. Right? So now if we go into our scene, I need to apply and save it. So now our light is blinking, and hopefully it's blinking enough and it's bright enough and it's conspicuous enough that it's going to draw the VR player's attention to say, oh, there's something going on here, right? We can do this in a variety of ways, right? I can make the scene completely dark and put a big bright spotlight on. And then that seems pretty obvious. I should go and investigate what's there, right? I can have everything white and there's a big splash of color, right? So things like contrast, lighting, whatever tricks you can muster or think of to draw your player's attention, right? We can't use cheese, but we can kind of make fake cheese, virtual cheese, right? That's what we're trying to make. Right? So now that we got their attention, what do they do? Right? Okay, so now what? I see the blinking light, I go there, I don't see anything. Like what am I going to introduce, right? And so my objective, like I said, was to turn it into some kind of a recorded message, right? I'm in somebody else's home and I'm playing their answering. You guys know what an answering machine is? Yes. I know it's called voicemail today, but back in the day, there was a thing called an answering machine, which is like recorded tape, right? on landline telephones that would record these messages, right? And again, I'm referring to this technology because this project is old, right? It was built in the 70s, I think, maybe even earlier. And so I want to represent that technology, right? And then if we look back, right, this is not an MP3 player, right? This is not streaming Spotify. This is a reel-to-reel tape deck and an amplifier and like a digital clock that's like flipping numbers through a Rolodex. You don't even know what a Rolodex is, probably. So it's very old technology. And because I want to represent this project in the way or in the spirit of the era in which it existed, I'm trying to use that same old technology, or at least imply it in virtual space, right? So I want then, now that I've got the player's attention and I've brought them here, I need to give the player something to do. I'm gonna create a series of buttons, right, to indicate or to like make them want to push it, right? And if they push the button, something's going to happen. So, you know, we're still kind of blocking things out. So what I'm going to use is a cube, because if you can do it with a cube, you can do it with anything. Right. So I'm going to drag a couple of cubes over here. I'm going to rotate it. I'll drag, right? I'm just kind of aligning it to what's in that drawing, right? But I'll probably put the buttons on something else when I determine what that is, right? But I'm working on the mechanics of it. And so if I can do it with a cube, I can do it with anything. Okay, so I might as well just start with a cube, right? Would you push one of these things? Does it look like a button for you? Right? What can I can make it red? Well, do you guys ever play tapes? They're like colors to buttons too, back in the day, or they're shapes, right? What's the play button shape? Yeah, the triangle, right? So like what I can do is maybe, you know, as I develop my scene, I can have a button that looks like that. What does that mean? Right? It's like universal, right? Let's fast forward, right? Back in the VHS days, right? We would rewind it back. But I can do a lot more to make my buttons look more like buttons, all in the interest of getting someone to interact with it, right? Because if they just saw a cube, maybe they wouldn't know what it was. You certainly wouldn't know what the left cube is from the right, right? So the first thing I want to be able to do is identify for the player what it is, and then I want them to interact with it, right? And so if you have a button, what does one do to a button? Let's all sort of pantomime pushing a button, right? You take your finger and you ram it, right? You collide with it, right? You want to be one with it. You intersect with the button, right? And so here's the visualization of what we want to do. But in actuality, we want the player to be able to interact with it or touch it, right? But we're in VR, right? They're not physically going to touch it. So we need to tell a computer how that mechanic's going to work. And then when that thing gets touched, we want that thing to kind of go down. And then we want it to pop back up, right? So something like that, like just mental picture right now, right? Right now, we're just dealing with cubes. But if we want to start to create some kind of interactive mechanic, we're going to want to do something a little bit more sophisticated, right? So I'm going to create a blueprint to do all of this stuff. Okay. So let's go to content again. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm just going to call it my blueprints. If you have just one, that's fine. If you have 0, that's fine. Right? What's more important is what's the experience, right? Because you can do a lot without blueprints too, right? Like that flashlight that I made. It's just a grabbable actor and I can move it around and it's a flashlight and I can have the player go discover things in the dark, right? And that could be the extent of it, right? But in this case, I want to, create a tape player. And so that requires a little bit more functionality. So I'm going to go ahead in my blueprints folder after this auto save goes through. I'm going to right click, or I can click on this plus button, but I'm going to right click and create a blueprint. And I'm going to click on this blueprint class. And more often than not, you're going to just select actor, right? If I were making a new character or a pawn, I would use these other ones. But for 90% of the time, you're just going to select actor, right? And I'm just going to call this BP underscore buttons. Okay. And I'm going to double click on that to open. Okay. No matter what file you're in, I want you to create a blueprint. Right. I don't care if you didn't add cubes to your scene, doesn't matter. We're going to add cubes to the blueprint. Okay. So everyone please create a blueprint and you should be in a scene that looks like this. Okay. So visually, I want this. Right. So in our blueprint, how do we get cubes in? Right. So a blueprint is like a world, like a mini world within our world. Right. It looks the same. We have a viewport. We have our little add components instead of the place actors. And we have our detail. Right. There's nothing in it right now, but we need to add stuff. Right. But the language is slightly different. Right. But it's not. Because what is a cube if not just a static mesh? Right? Except this static mesh, the cube that Unreal gives us is a static mesh, plus it has a box collider associated with it, right? So it's got a little bit more going on, but for all intents and purposes, it's just a static mesh. Oops. So back in our BP buttons, I'm going to go ahead and click add. Static mesh. In fact, I could just add a cube if I wanted to, but I want to just go simple. I'm a minimalist, right? Let's just do static mesh. I'm going to do button play. Right? And so with my static mesh highlighted, we can see we have details that relate to static meshes, right? Nothing happened here because we've just essentially created a pocket that accepts a static mesh. We haven't assigned a static mesh yet. So we're going to do that next, right? Remember, computers are dumb. You have to tell it everything that you want, right? So I'm going to look for a cube and add the static mesh cube, right? And we have a very basic, untextured, unmaterial cube that comes with Unreal, right? I want to go back to my scene. I want to see what this cube is all about, right? Let's just go to general, right? I've scaled this down to 0.036, right? And I want it to appear roughly like this. So in my blueprint, I'm just going to change the scale to 0.036. Oops, and hit F to focus. I'm going to slow down my camera so I can see, right? So there's my cube. Back in my scene. This cube and this cube are roughly 11 centimeters apart, right? So going back into our blueprint, right? I can just hit Alt. Actually, I guess I can't. I can just right click here and duplicate. And move this over.
Is-
Yeah.
Is it possible to copy, then from the other view and move it again to where it?
You can. So if I were to select these two cubes, I could convert this into a blueprint. And then it'll just bring cubes into my. So yes, I mean, maybe you would do it if there's something more complex that you want to incorporate in. And the way I think you do that, you just right click. There is, I don't remember how to do it. Maybe edit. That's a quick YouTube search or a Google search. It's a quick Google search. But yes, you can select your items and then convert that into it. I just can't remember how to do it off the top of my head. And so I want the two buttons here. So I'm just going to duplicate one button. But I'm just going to undo that for a moment because I want to do a little bit more. I want to create one button more fully so that I can just reduce the work, make one button good, and then just duplicate that in my blueprint. Or I could just use the blueprint twice. Okay. So I want to be able to also interact with this button, right? And so what I need to do is give it a collider, right? Remember, a static mesh is just the appearance of something, right? You can't interact with something if it doesn't have some kind of a collision associated with it, right? So I'm going to add a collider. I'm going to add a box collision, right? And I'm going to just scale this down. That close enough. I'm going to set this to 0, 0, 0. If I click on this little arrow, it like sets it to the default values. Let's try 3, 3, 3. Right. I'm going to reduce X and Y, but I may want to give it a little bit more on the Z axis. Now, why do you think I would make a collider that looks like this, as opposed to making it look like the cube? It's a good guess. But remember, what's the collider for? It's an interactive space, right? So I actually want, like, I could have made this a cube, but that could have been like that too, right? Because the appearance of the button doesn't matter. It's where the button and the button and the finger are going to intersect that matters, right? Because the player is not physically pushing this thing, I just need the player's finger to get close enough to it, right? So that I can match the intention of the player going like this to the desired result, which is the button to then move down. That makes sense. So now I have my play button and I have a box collider. I don't know that I need them to be a child, have a parent relationship, right? And so now I have these two things going on, right? Let's hit compile. Go to my VR template. Now, if I drag my blueprint button, I can rotate it. Move it in place. Okay, so now we have a button and we have our fake button. Let's move it up. Let's go back to our, okay. So what do we want to happen with this button? Right? Use like dumb computer terminology, like words that a computer can understand. Yeah, we just need the button to move as a result of a player intersecting with this collider, right? It's not being pushed, right? Pushed is too big of a concept at the moment, right? We need the button to move, right? Which orientation, which axis do we want the button to move? The Z-axis. How do we tell the computer which direction we want the button? Yeah, negative versus positive values, right? And so the origin of the button, right, is the 0, 0, 0, the origin of my blueprint, right? So this button has a local origin of 0, 0, 0. The button as a blueprint in my environment has a separate transform, right? I've rotated it and it resides in this position, right? But the button has its own kind of world that it occupies too, right? So it's important to separate these two things. So there's a world location or a world transform, and within its own space, it has its own transform, right? So it's something to keep in mind. Now, whatever we want to happen, we use the event graph to do that. This is where we do our scripting, right? So it's an event graph because we place events that trigger things to occur, right? So begin play is an event, right? It's when we hit the play button. It just starts when the game starts, right? But there are other events like event tick, which is firing every time the game clock ticks. So it's constantly firing, right? Event begin play, it fires at one time when you hit play, right? And then there are other events that we create, which is if we select our box, we can scroll down to the bottom here, and we can pick an event that's associated with a box, right? So we want on component begin overlap. Does that make sense? So we want when something overlaps with that box that we created to then trigger a series of events and fire it. And what we want to do is add, let me just double check. There are a lot of not add. You want to set relative you want to set the relative location of something, right? What do we want to change the relative location of? Right? Basically, we only have two things in our blueprint. right? So what are we moving? Are we moving the collider or are we moving the static mesh? Yeah. Right, so we're just concerned with changing the relative location. What did we say? What axis are we moving? And then by how much should we move it? What should we make this value? Negative. -1. Let's see what happens. Right? And so now I'm going to hit compile. Right? We got a green checkbox, which means it should work. Right? And now in our VR template, I'm going to drag this cube. I'm going to see if I can use this cube to create my collision. Right? I'm going to just hit simulate. Oh, there. Here's what I'm going to do instead. I'm going to let gravity do my job for me, right? I'm going to turn physics on this cube. Simulate physics and enable gravity. So let's hit simulate. Did it collide? I can't even tell. Let's try just to make sure. I'm going to just make it move in a much larger number than I think is necessary. So for all intents and purposes, this should disappear when this box collides or overlaps. What? With my trigger box. So let's try this. That didn't work. Right? So maybe what I need to do here is to browse to asset. Click. I mean, it seems like it already had one. I think it must need to be triggered by the player. So let me get my let's get the player. So if you're in this file, you should be able to go to your third person blueprints folder and bring in a character. I'm gonna give this I'm just gonna place a cube underneath her. Why is my widget not showing up? I'm gonna lower this volume below her feet. And I want to move this over here. And it's going to scale this a little longer, right? If I want to use this character that's in my scene, I was telling Tara this and whoever was here earlier, I just need to possess this character. So I want to set auto possess player 0. So now if I hit play, why did I appear there? Maybe because the sequencer is on. Let's see if this works. There we go. Right. So problem is I did not bring my VR headset with me. Can I borrow one of your headsets? So I'm going to save this. I'm going to just try something real quick just to make sure that this is going to, that there's something else not wrong with this. I'm going to add a key event for a keyboard. And let's say with the Z key, I want to be able to move. I want on begin play, be able to enable keyboard input. So let's hit compile. I'm just going to see if I can hit the Z key to move this thing and see if that works. Right. It's hard to see, right? Can you see the cube? Every time I hit the Z key, it only did it once. Let's try it again. Right, you see the button, if I hit the Z key, it moves it down 10, right? So we know that the code is working. It's just the collider, the collision doesn't seem to be working. Let's try playing it again after this. File. I don't think we need this, so I'm going to just turn that off. I'm going to hit play again. And so I'm going to move. Not. Wonder if there's something wrong. Hmm?
You can ask to maybe the
I mean, I shouldn't have to. I think if the capsule collider interacts with this, it should just do it unless this character. You know, I'm gonna just add a box collision. Yeah, so for whatever reason, the collider that she has doesn't interact. Okay. So let's try this in VR. Why don't we take a 5-minute break while I connect Liam's headset?
Oh. No, maybe I mentioned it, yeah, but it's the job itself. Yeah, and we're paying the. Yeah, yeah, I don't know what about. And like this is very. I think. Oh, no, did you get? Yeah, this class started off, this is where there's construction in the block. One of the sidewalks. A little bit. We don't go, I was go inside. The courtyard. Live in the house and then. I go. And then, we go to the this one. I didn't know that I still, this is my roof now, it's so much taller, right? Then I take them from the line. This goes.
Think that escaping access to the like drives, like and that's also account. It's like one needed but uncoordinated. Feels like What, it's like 10 dogs have the same thing.
And I'm not thinking she's from giving her I don't know. A lot of people will call them. And I don't know if I want to know if it's something. We got to in the practice. That is the yeah. Honestly, I don't know if this is.
That's like, I really. That's like.
I know, but I'm also terrible at it, but I just wanted to find it for going to the intersection. And I want my voice to step forward them and I'm competing with all these other sounds and I have to, keep it moving, but also talk to them. Yeah, that's what I think. I think yeah, there's a time some sort of obstacle. And also the private books were really probably really have one. Yep. Movies, but you never had a voice on it, which the most interesting thing where it's being put in inflation. And I feel like I knew where to get to. But yeah, I just we have
Okay, let's get back to it.
No.
Yeah.
Well, no air conditioning. None of them have. How did you
Okay, let's get started again. Is everyone back? More or less? Are we missing anybody that was here? Lynn, here she comes. Great. Okay, so I know some of you want to have VR interactions with things like particles and stuff like that. So this will be very relevant to you. But good to know regardless. You guys all did the blueprint tutorial where we looked at sockets, right? To like connect things to sockets. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take our VR hand and we're gonna add a collider to it so that in my case, I'm just gonna put it on the index finger so that the index finger can interact with these elements, right? But you could use like a sphere collider for your whole hand. So if you wave things around, you could like move particles around and things of that nature, right? But we do need to modify some things first, right? So we need to go into the VR template, go into blueprint, and we need to go into the VR pawn and open that VR pawn. And you can see it's a very complex set of scripts that allow for the different functionality that we were able to do in the VR template scene. But what we're really concerned with is just looking at the skeletal mesh, right? So let's take our right hand, for instance, right? So here's our motion controller grip. Here's referring to a skeleton, the right hand. And I'm gonna see or notice that in the details panel here, the skeletal mesh that's being used is called SKM_Manny XR right? If I click on this little browse to button, I'm gonna find where that is, where that skeletal mesh is in our contents. If I double click on this, right, I have now my skeletal mesh. And if I go and start selecting some of these bones, strange place for this to be located, but it's identifying the wrong finger, but the ring bone is more or less where I want my collider to be, right? And so it's not just a ring bone, it's the third bone of the ring bone, right? So this is the finger I want, right? And it's essentially got these parent-child relationships so that the finger can kind of function the way our fingers function, right? But I want the very tip of this. I'm going to add a socket. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to add a socket and I'm going to move that socket even closer to the tip of the finger, right? But this socket is a child of that last bone. So as that last bone moves, the socket will also move in the same way that the hat on the player that you created stays on the head, right? You guys did the tutorial, right? Yes. And so I'm going to save this and go back to my VR pawn, go to my viewport, and I'm going to select my right hand. I'm going to hit the F key to fly to. Let's slow down my camera. And then I'm going to add a sphere collider. And with the sphere collider selected, I'm going to go to this parent socket, and I'm going to look for the socket that I created. which is actually at the very top. Right? And so what that's going to do is it's going to move my sphere collider to the fingertip, but it's way too big. So I'm going to shrink down the radius of the sphere. Zoom in a little bit here. So that it's, really quite just going to kind of coincide with the tip of the finger. Right, and I can fine tune the adjustment. I can't tell if I'm doing this right. Let's just leave it at that. I think that'll be good enough. And I'm going to hit compile. And so now in my scene, I have a collider on my finger that I should be able to interact with the collider on my button. And let's see if it works now that I have headsets. Play. Right, so you guys can all see my finger. Did you see that disappear? Yeah, so now the collider on my hand is interacting. So if I stick my head through this, I can see where that is, right? It moved too far, right? And we kind of knew that it would because I exaggerated its movement. But if we go back to our button event graph, let's set it to -1, hit compile, and let's try it again and see if 1 was close or if we need to adjust even further. Oh dear. So here's my finger, right? It barely moved. And so we'll want to move it a little bit more. Right? Go back. Let's try -3. And hit play. That's a little too much, right? So we can kind of fine tune how far that needs to go. Right? Something like that, right? It moved down, but it didn't disappear, right? And that might be enough, right? It gives us the appearance of the button moving down. We could also add functionality to the button itself. And we can say, okay, let's set a delay and make that a 2-second delay. And then I'm going to want it to pop back up. And let's see if that works. Right, so wait 2 seconds and it pops back up. Wait 2 seconds and it pops back up, right? I don't know if that's what I want this button to do, but if that is what I wanted, I'd be done, right? I might want it to not just disappear, but maybe depress over time. So I can maybe incorporate something more of an animation with it. And so maybe I would prefer the look of that a little bit better. So let's get rid of this delay component for now. And this other, I might revisit that because maybe I want the button to pop back up. But maybe instead of just it jumping minus 2.2, maybe I want it to depress over a period of time, right? Like it's quick, but it'll maybe add to the illusion of realism. And so I'm going to use what's called a timeline. And I'm going to call this button offset. Right? And I want to play a timeline and use the output of that timeline to set the relative location. Right? So if I double click on the timeline, a timeline is just it's just a container that can hold variables and distribute things out over a period of time. Right? So again, it's very dumb in the sense that you have to dictate what all of these things that we want are, right? So if we go back to our event graph for a moment. Right? We want to affect this transfer. Right? So we could use a variable in our timeline called a vector track that'll feed into that vector slot, right? These are also color coordinated, right? I could also just break this, right? Split this up. So I'm splitting my variable into 3 floats. And I can create a separate input for that. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm only affecting the Z location. I'm only changing one number, right? So rather than doing a vector track, in which case I have to control 3 numbers in my timeline, I just want to create a float track and call this offset Z, right? And I can right click and I can just add a key and right click anywhere else and add a key. And I can basically spit out a different value over a period of time, right? I want my button press to be quick. So I might make this a ½ second, right? And I actually don't need more than just one key. At time 0, I'm going to set this to minus here. Actually, let's make it 2 seconds so we can see it. And I'm going to make this minus 0.5, right? So for every game tick, every tick of the clock, this timeline is going to spit out minus 0.5, minus 0.5, minus 0.5, minus 0.5 into my set relative location node, right? So this might actually be a little too much. I'm going to let's try minus 0.2, and we'll tweak it as we go, right? So now if we go back to our event graph, that track that I created on the timeline is now available to us, and I can feed that into the set relative location. So now the timeline is feeding this node. So I'm going to hit compile, and nice, it seems to work. We can go back into VR, and then hopefully that is going to have the effect. So what we should see is that button moving, you know, a certain distance in the negative x-axis over 2 seconds of time, right? So let's see if that works. So now if I touch the button, it barely moved. So let's see what went wrong there. Let's go to the button. Let me try something else here instead. I'm gonna split this as well. I'm gonna try feeding this into a different node. There's my finger, and we can see that the button kind of pushed away and it's down there. So over 2 seconds, it traveled that far. And in fact, let's see if I can keep doing it. Yeah, so my box collider is over here, right? So my box collider is still here, and every time I touch it, that button is going to continue to move further and further away. Right? Which is obviously not what we want, but we at least know that it's. I changed the set relative location to add actor local offset. And what this does is every time I trigger something to happen, it's going to continue to move. Right? So it's going to move relative to its local position. And so if I push it once, it's going to change its local position, and I push it again, it's going to keep going. When I used this node, it only moved its relative location, but it kept it where its new relative location. So I wasn't able to do it multiple times. So either of these would work, but maybe the add local offset works a little bit better, except it went way too far. I'm going to go to my key, this node here, and let's just change it to -0.02 instead. And then the other thing I can do, I guess it doesn't really matter. Let's test it out, see if the distance is better. So let's push the button, and over 2 seconds it goes down, maybe a little bit too far, but pretty close. And so we can adjust our timeline to fix that. I actually want the button to move a little faster. So I'm going to change the duration to ½ a second and maybe have it move a little bit more so that overall it's moving faster, but at a greater distance. So let's see if that feels more natural or more button-like. Right, something like that, but maybe even faster still. Right, but I can tweak that. It's at least working the way I want it to. I'm interacting with a button, the button is moving, the button goes down. I can do the same thing. Let's go back to the button event graph. Let's say after let's delete this. Let's bring that delay back. Right, after 2 seconds, let's move that back up. 2 seconds. 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 So press, wait 2 seconds, and it kind of pops back up. It's doing some weird stuff. Right? But it's kind of working. Right? So you're going to want to tweak some of these values so that it works a little bit more precisely. But essentially, if I can get the button to depress, maybe I'm happy with that, and then I'll tweak it a little bit further, right? But I want the button to, before I go nuts trying to make the button move super precisely, I want the button to do some other things in my scene, right? Essentially, I want the button to play a recording, right? So we need to find what that recording is, and the recording should be appropriate to the scene that I'm trying to create. I mentioned earlier that I'm looking for kind of old technology, kind of the answering machine feel. And so I went into freesound.org.
Friday,
See if this plays,
1:24
right?
p.m.
And just found stock recording somebody did.
End of messages.
Right, of an answering machine, right? And then I can download this to my computer as a WAV file, right? We need to use WAV files. So if you have an MP3, you have to convert that. At least I think you do. Maybe Unreal Engine accepts MP3 files now, but for the most part, WAV files definitely works. I'm going to create a folder. And I want to sort of keep everything organized. And I'm going to put my audio in here. So I can click on this add button and import my sound. And I could also drag it into this folder as well, but this is always a safer way to go, right?
Friday,
And so now I have
1:24
this
p.m.
recording in my project, right? I may want other things in my blueprint to mimic the playing of these sounds. For instance, we can go back into our viewport, right? I might just duplicate this play button at this point, now that I have the button working okay. I'm going to call this my stop button. And I want to move this over by about 11 centimeters. And I'm going to duplicate this as well. In fact, let's undo that. I'm going to make this box collision a child of that, and let's duplicate now. Oh, it still didn't do it. I guess I have to duplicate this too. Call this box 2. Rename. Stop. We want to move it about 11, I think. Let's go back to our scene. It went to the top there. So I moved it on the wrong axis. I'm just going to rotate it this way by 90. Right? So here are 2 buttons. But we may also want something else here. I might grab a cylinder Shrink it down quite a bit. Flatten it. Now, if we look on our, where's our, somewhere, right, it's over here. So I need to pull it up a little bit more. So the orientation or the rotation, I want this to be 45. And let's just move it out. Right? And then shrink it down. Up. Right? I just want to place a thing that's going to stand in as the appearance of the speaker. Right? And this is also based on right, except I guess they put their speakers on the other surface. So I might reposition that later. Right? So I'm essentially recreating these scenes. There are speakers there. I want the sound to come out of these locations. So in Unreal, in my audio folder, I also need something called a sound cue. And I'm going to call this answer machine underscore or SC underscore answering machine. I'm going to double click on this to open it up. I'm going to undock that, go back into my folder. I'm just going to drag this recording in. And all I need to do is to connect this to this. And it's saved. Okay, it's kind of a convoluted step, but it's a necessary one. So now my BP buttons, maybe I should call it BP buttons and speaker. I need I think it's called sound source, or maybe it's audio. I just need to add an audio component. I don't know why it's automatically selecting it's because it's highlighted. Let's uncheck that. I just want you to know what it looks like. It's doing something that makes it slightly more convenient, but let's just go to audio, click on audio. I'm going to call this answering audio. And then here, right, with my audio selected, I'm going to select that sound source. Can this play directly? And I want this to come from my speaker so that when I'm in VR space, it sounds like coming from the speaker. So the closer I get to the speaker, the louder it will be, right? So it starts to feel much more spatial. Sound cue answering machine. Let's go back. Let's see. Right. I actually want to use the sound cue folder file that I created here. Okay. I'm just going to delete the button popping up logic for now, and then go back to my button. So in addition to the button depressing, I also want the button to trigger the audio to play, right? And so the next link in the chain is I want to play an audio file. What's the name of this? Yeah. Play. Right, and it's just automatically selecting my answering audio, right? So let's do that without anything selected, just so you can see, right? I guess it's just going to look for the audio that's there. And then I just want to make sure that that's linked. Actually, what I want to do is make this play after my timeline is completed. Right? So the timeline is firing this add local offset several times. And once it's done, I can then have it play the audio, right? So the button moves and depresses, and then the audio starts. So let's see if that works. Hopefully it does. So let's hit play again.
End of messages.
It's playing by itself.
Friday, 1:24 p.m.
So it's kind of working, but it's also playing by itself. So let me see if I can stop that from happening. Let's open the sound cue. It might be that the audio clip is set to just play on.
Friday, 1:20. Friday.
I don't know why it's playing on when the game starts, but I'll have to figure out why that is. But let's try it just to make sure that the button is actually triggering the sound play.
24 p.m. End of messages.
So
Friday, 1:24.
so it is
p.m.
playing after it presses.
End of messages.
Let's try one more time.
Friday, 1.
Yeah, so it's working. I just need to not have it play when the game starts. So I'll have to figure that out. I'll have to do a Google search to try to fix that. Okay. So, I mean, basically all this to show how do you move something? How do you create an interaction using colliders with a VR pawn? How to play audio and how to maybe begin to manipulate materials. Maybe going back to the materials for a moment. If we go into our custom materials, I can right click on the material that I created and create a material instance of that. And apply this material instead. And what this will allow me to do is a material instance. When I double click on it to open it, it doesn't give me the same interface as this, right? It gives me a different interface, which only allows me to revise or adjust the parameters that I set up in that original material, right? So the parameters, for instance, I made a vector parameter for color. And so let's say I want to create a material instance of that original material, except I don't want it to be a red light, I want it to be a green light. And so I can use that same master material to create a variety of other materials as instances of that material and just revise the parameters. Let's say I want my light to blink much faster, right? And so I can create a, right click and create a material instance. And maybe I'll call this red, and I can right click. Whoops. Right click, rename this green, right? So now I'm using the same master material, but I can just kind of toggle between different versions of them to see what I like better, right? And so, you know, the reason why this is helpful is sometimes these materials can get really complex, especially Quixel materials, for instance. Do I still have that one open? If we go back to Quixel Bridge and look at the stucco, right? These are all material instances, right? So if I double click on that, my interface is allowing me to interface with just the parameters that are set up in that master material. So I can go in and change the textures if I want to, change all of these maps. But all of this is working off of what's called this M_MS surface material, which is a master material. If I went to that and opened it up, you'll see that right, it's very complicated the way they set it up, right? So they set up one master material that essentially works with all of the Megascans textures that they're going out to scan and create the different types of maps for. So when you're working with Quixel materials, you're actually manipulating the material instance, right? But this kind of gives you an idea of the structure of what a material looks like versus what a material instance looks like. Let's go to some of the questions. For instance, Tara was asking about bringing in, let's say, more complex assets from Sketchfab. So I'm just going to create a monster truck folder. I think the monster truck might still be in my downloads. Maybe not. There it is. I'm gonna open this. How do I unzip this? Extract all. Extract. Right. So now I'm in my monster truck folder. I'm going to go ahead and click add. I'm going to import something to that monster truck folder. I'm going to double click on this, double click on the source, and I have an FBX file here. If I click open, I'm going to uncheck the missing collisions. I usually like to add my own collisions, but you could certainly make its collisions too, but it might not work as well as you would hope. And here, you want to check this box, combine meshes. And what that's going to do is it's going to take all of the little pieces and put them together in one element. So in the advanced tab, you can check combine meshes. And that's going to import my monster truck as one thing. And so if we go outside here, I can drag this in and it's just one element, right? If I go back into my content, let's create another folder, call it monster. That's right. So let's go ahead and click add. Let's import that same asset, except this time I'm not going to combine meshes. You can see that it comes in a bunch of different pieces, right? If you use Shift and click all of the assets, you can still bring them in and they'll look the same, right? And in here, you can right click and you can group these, right? And it'll sort of behave as one, right? So there are a couple of options there, right? The other thing to take into consideration is these materials don't come in the wing, right? And so what happens is we get different materials for the different pieces. But what we're going to have to also do is, let's right click here. Actually, let's not right click. Let's just go into our downloads folder. Right. So FBX imports, we get the source model, but we also get the textures. So what we need to do is we need to grab these textures and bring them into our scene as well. I'm going to just drag them in. Right. And usually, not always, but usually you can kind of tell what part belongs where, right? Because you see this one says underscore tire. This one says underscore engine. This one says underscore transparent. Is there something called transparent in there? So you kind of have to guess a little bit what these are related to. This one's exploded axles, right? So if I double click on the axles material, let's undock that so we can look at it, right? And then I find, or I have to try to find the texture that corresponds. So here's the axle texture, and then set that as the base color. And then hit apply. You can see that my axle is now properly textured, right? You know, this, let's look at the body. Let's open up the body. I'm going to put it, dock it in here and look for the texture that refers to the body. Fire. Right? This one says body, right? So then I can drag this into that body material and use this texture as the base color and hit apply. And it should replace why is that the case? Let's highlight the box. Let's close this. Right. It looks like the body has not been assigned. And so it's again a little bit of a guessing game. So now that I've mapped the texture to the body material, I might have to kind of guess, right? That's not the right one. So I'm going to undo it. I'm going to like just toss it into these elements. So this was the right one, right? So in the asset, you'll have a bunch of material slots. So it might be a little bit of a guessing game, but all of the textures are there. The model should be mapped. And so you just have to do a little bit of trial and error to make that work. But for the most part, you shouldn't have like as many materials as this. And if you do, then you have a little bit of extra work to do, but it's easier than making a model from scratch, definitely. Okay, any questions? Any other questions? Like I was saying, there's really no real need. Like if you can do something that's not within blueprints, you could definitely do that, right? I might just find an asset. So like the boat example that you had, right? If I want to turn, let's say I want to just make a simple boat. I'm going to call it a raft, right? I'm just going to take a cube and give it a rough shape. I want this to have physics, right? Because I want to be able to interact with it. So with my cube selected, I'm going to go down to physics. I'm going to simulate physics, but I'm going to uncheck gravity. So I can physically interact with this, but not have gravity constantly pulling it down, right? I can also add constraints to it where I can lock its X position, or sorry, its Z position, so that it doesn't move in the Z axis. And I don't want it to rotate in the Y or the X axis. I only want it to rotate in the Z axis, so I can lock the X and the Y rotation of this particular asset, right? There's also, right, I want to be able to steer and move. So I'm going to grab another cube, right? Again, if you can do it with a cube, you can do it with anything. I'm going to stretch this, make it nice and thin. I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees, and I'm going to move this up. And again, I want this to have physics, and I want this to have gravity, right? So if I hit simulate real quick, what's going to happen is my stick's going to fall onto my boat, but my boat's not going to fall, right?
Friday,
Because
1,
I've blocked,
24
I've
p.m.
restrained the Z-axis movement, right? And I want to be able to ride this, right? So when you have something moving, you can't really teleport onto it because navigation doesn't work that way. What I might do instead is go to my VR template, go into my blueprints, and I'm going to grab my VR pawn and I'm going to place my VR pawn on this, right? And I want my VR pawn to be a child of my raft. So I'm always on the raft, right? So let me just rename my cube so I can identify it easily. I'm gonna call it VR raft, right? And so now I can make my VR pawn a child of my VR raft. And so if I move my my raft around, my pawn's gonna go with it, right? And maybe I'll rotate this so that I'm pointing quote unquote forward, right? And so now if I hit simulate, right?
Friday,
Same thing's happening. It might,
1:24 p.m.
I'm gonna raise this up a little bit. Sorry, I'm gonna raise this up a little bit. And then hit simulate. I should stay on my
Friday,
boat.
1:20.
Okay. So I also need to take my VR pawn and I need to make that the character that I possess, right? So anytime I add my own character or pawn into the scene, I have to and I want to possess that. I need to set auto possess player on this asset. So with my VR pawn selected, I'm going to type auto in the search to get to this auto possess player. And I want to set this to player 0, which means when I hit play, the player is player 0. And Real Engine starts with 0 instead of 1. So 0 is just the designation for the first player, right? So now when I hit play, I don't possess the location of the player start. I possess the pawn that I placed in my scene, right? And so now if I simulate in VR,
p.m.
right, here I am. I'm on my boat, right? So far so good. That's all working. I want to be able to interact with this with my VR pawn. So if you recall, when I made the flashlight, I'm going to grab this cube and I'm going to add a component to it. And that component is a grab component. Right? So now I should be able to use my controllers to grab this. And I'm going to rename this as well. So VR boat stick. You guys can make better names for these. And then maybe I do need to enable grab here. But I constrained its Z movement, so it's still not going to drop. So let's simulate and see what happens.
Friday, 1:24 p.m.
So let's go into VR preview.
p.m.
So now I can pick up my stick.
End of
Whoa, so
this.
now I'm moving, right? Because the stick has physics. My what I'm standing on has physics. And if I like tap on this, I can kind of, right? You can't maybe tell on the screen, but I'm totally moving and it's quite dizzying and uncomfortable, right? So what I can do here with my VR raft selected, I can change my damping, which is like the friction that it experiences. I'm going to set these both to 5 and then try again. And so now
PM.
I shouldn't move so freely. I can grab this stick,
End of
right?
messages.
But I move a little bit and then I stop, right? So I can kind of tap my own boat. This isn't obviously the best kind of mechanic for moving a boat around, like, but you can start to see that I'm not actually like I'm not actually making a blueprint to move myself. I'm using just physics, and I lost my stick, so now I can't move. Can I tap myself? No, I can't. Right? And so I don't even need to create a blueprint necessarily to create interactions. I can just use the grab component and physics to try to simulate certain things that I might be interested in trying to recreate. But like if I wanted to create a boat logic, I can just maybe create a button on the boat the same way I created a button for the audio. And every time I push the button, I can give my boat a little bump in the butt, like using a physics impulse to propel it forward, right? Where I can pull a lever and it increases the amount of force being applied to the back of my cube, or you'll find a better boat model, so that I can control it like I'm controlling a motorboat, right? And so it's really up to how you design the experience and how you determine the mechanics of how these things work, right? Like I can make a button to play a recording, an infinite number of ways, but I also want to make it the most generic way as well, so that someone can intuitively just interact with it and know what to do, right? I see a button, I push it. If it has a triangle, I know it's a play button. I see a blinking light, I go to it, right? Maybe not, but you're just hoping that for the most part, that the piece of cheese that you left in your maze is enough to get the person to go there or to do what you want them to do in that space. Okay. Any questions? I know it's a lot. Did you guys follow along on blueprints? Yeah. Did you get the button to move at least? Yes? No? I guess you don't have your headsets? You guys didn't bring your headsets? That's okay. Next time, bring your headsets. We have a couple more weeks, basically, right? Next week is just gonna be like a work session. So bring your projects, work on the interactions, right? I'll discuss anything you want, your cinematics, right? You're trying to get your character to do something and animate them in a certain way, but you can't get it to work. Or you're working on your VR scene where I'm trying to create a blueprint for X, Y, and Z and doesn't seem to be working, or like, let's troubleshoot either of those next week, which means the expectation is you've gotten to a certain point on either of those by then, right? And then maybe I'll talk a little bit more about materials and maybe polishing up your scenes a little bit, but I might do that asynchronously and just send you some tutorials, like recordings of my sort of beautifying my capsule tower scene a little bit and show you what I do to do that, right? Because just dealing with materials in itself is quite complex. So I want you to make it as beautiful as you can, but I don't need photoreal. I'm more interested in sort of the whole scene and the mechanics of VR as you're trying to implement. That makes sense? Okay. Okay, cool. You're free to go. Thank you, Liam, for the use of your headset.
It's like a voice.
Oh. Well, I hope it's.
Yeah, okay.
Hope that's still.
Oh, you did? Oh, no.
If it doesn't, just get another one.
I'm serious. I guess you're supposed to walk around.
Well, I guess that's the idea. Technically, if you guys are upstairs, you can try to connect via Bluetooth, via wireless. Um, but yeah, the cable is quite unruly. Thank you. Yeah.